I heard him say it through the wall of our bedroom. His voice was certain, the way it always was when he spoke to his beta second. Kieran is disposable. I chose him because omegas stabilize pack bonds during formation. Once the pack is solid, I will find a proper mate. Someone with standings. Someone worthy of the Vale name. I stood in the hallway holding the tea I made for him. Hand steady, cup unbroken. I stood there while the man I gave 3 years of my life to explained my worth to someone else. Then I walked to our nest, removed my bonding ring, and placed it in the center of the blankets I had spent weeks weaving. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you are watching from and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. My name was Kieran Ashvale, and I was 24 years old when I became Roan Vale's bonded Omega, and 27 when I understood with total and devastating clarity what I had actually been. The Vale Pack was one of the oldest in the Northern Territories. Roan had inherited the Alpha seat at 22 after his father's health declined, and the pack had been unstable during the transition, in the way that packs always are when power changes hands without ceremony. There had been friction between the older betas who had served his father and the younger alphas Roan was quietly assembling around himself. The pack bonds that should have held firm were fraying at every seam, and Omega could fix that. Everyone in the pack dynamics world knew it, and Omega's pheromones, particularly one who nested with the alpha and allowed a deep bond formation, acted as a kind of social adhesive. The warmth spread outward, the tension eased, hierarchies settled into place. Roan had known this. I had not known that this was why he chose me. I had grown up in a small town 3 hours east of the city where the Vale territory sat. My mother was an Omega who ran a fabric shop, and my father was a quiet beta school teacher, and neither of them had ever moved in the circles where pack politics and calculated bonding arrangements were ordinary conversations. What I knew about alphas I had learned from the way my mother talked about my father, which was with the easy warmth of two people who had genuinely chosen each other and never regretted it. I thought bonding worked that way for everyone. When Roan came to the fabric shop 6 months after taking the alpha seat, I thought it was coincidence. He bought curtain fabric. He came back the following week for upholstery samples. The third time he asked if I wanted to have dinner. He was tall and broad-shouldered with dark black hair that he wore pushed back from his face, and his eyes were a gray that changed in different light. He spoke carefully like a man who had learned that precision mattered. He smelled of pine and cold water and something deeper underneath that my Omega instincts catalogued immediately as strength. I said yes to dinner. I said yes to everything eventually, because Roan was patient and deliberate and made me feel, in those early months, as though I was something he had been looking for a long time and had finally found. The bonding ceremony was small. His pack was there, 43 members at the time, and my parents came and my two closest friends from home. I wore pale gold. Roan wore black. When he pressed his lips to the curve of my neck and sealed the bond, I felt the connection snap into place like a key in a lock, and the warmth of it was so complete and so real that I cried a little and did not feel embarrassed about it at all. We lived in the Alpha House on the eastern edge of the Vale compound, a large stone building with high ceilings and drafty windows that I spent the first year quietly transforming into something that felt like a home. I built our nest in the bedroom with particular care. Soft fabrics from my mother's shop, the weight of blankets that were mine and also his, the specific layering that an Omega's instincts know even when the Omega in question has grown up in a fabric shop rather than a pack compound. The nest was the most honest thing I owned. It was the physical architecture of what I believed about us. Roan came home to it every night. He slept in it beside me, and he said on more than one occasion that the nest was the only place he felt the pressure of the pack seat lift from his shoulders. I took that as love because I did not know it was data. The 3 years were not unhappy. I want to be precise about this because the story of how I left is not the story of a man who was miserable and finally escaped. It is the story of a man who was reasonably content, who believed he was loved, who had built a life he thought was genuine, and who then discovered in a single hallway moment that the entire architecture of that life had been constructed on a calculation he had never been shown. Roan was not cruel to me. He was careful with me, the way a person is careful with something they have invested in. He remembered my preferences and bought flowers occasionally and never missed a significant date. He touched me with consistent warmth. He introduced me to his pack allies as his bonded Omega, with a particular note in his voice that I had always read as pride, and now, in retrospect, understood as the particular satisfaction of a well-functioning asset. His second, a beta named Cassiel Brandt, was the one I heard him speaking to. Cassiel had always been correct to me in the flat, professional way of someone executing a task. I had told myself that his coolness was simply his personality. What I understood now, standing in the hallway with cooling tea and a heart that had not yet started hurting because the damage was too clean and too sudden, was that Cassiel had always known exactly what I was. And I set the tea down on the hallway table. I walked into our bedroom. I crossed to the nest and picked up my bonding ring, which was a wide band of white metal with a small amber stone, and I held it for exactly 1 moment. The amber was the same shade as my hair in a certain light, and Roan had pointed that out on the day he gave it to me, and I thought it was romantic. Now I understood it as aesthetic coordination. An alpha who thought in systems would want his Omega's bonding ring to match. I placed the ring in the center of the nest, right in the warm heart of all those carefully chosen blankets. I did not leave a note. What would I have written? I heard you. That is all. I packed 1 bag. I had enough money in my personal account for several months, which I had accumulated from the small textile consultation work I had continued doing quietly throughout the 3 years, partly for something of my own, and partly because something in me had never fully stopped being the person who earned their own way. I called a car service and I walked out of the Alpha house on the eastern edge of the Vale compound without looking back at the nest I was leaving, because if I had looked back, I would not have been able to make my legs keep moving. The car took me to the train station. I bought a ticket to the furthest city on the departures board that I had a reason to go to, which turned out to be Halveth, a port city 8 hours south, where my father's sister ran a small tailoring business and where I had visited twice as a child and remembered as a place where the air tasted of salt and distance. I sat in my train seat with my bag on my lap, and I did not cry. Not on the train. Not when the city disappeared behind me, and the countryside opened up into flat, pale fields. I watched the fields, and I thought about the nest, and I thought about the specific way Roan had said disposable, not with malice, but with the calm matter-of-factness of a man stating an operational reality. And I felt the first real understanding of what 3 years had actually been settled into my body, like winter entering a building through a crack you had not found before. By the time I arrived in Halveth 8 hours later, the crack had widened considerably, but I was still standing. I had the bag on my shoulder, and my aunt's address and my phone and my own 2 feet, and whatever I had lost in that hallway, I still had all of those things, and I decided that would be enough to start with. My Aunt Dessa's tailoring shop occupied the ground floor of a narrow building 2 streets back from the harbor. She was a compact woman in her late 50s, with the same strong hands my father had, and the specific quality of directness that my father's side of the family carried like a genetic inheritance. When I arrived at her door at 11 at night, with my single bag and my carefully maintained composure, she took 1 look at me and said, "Come in," and put the kettle on without asking a single question. She did not ask questions that night. She made tea and fed me the leftover soup she had been keeping warm on the stove, and she gave me the small room at the top of the building where she kept bolts of fabric along 2 walls and had a narrow bed in the corner, and she said, "You can tell me when you are ready," and turned off the light and closed the door. I sat on the narrow bed in the fabric room, and I finally cried. Not loudly. The controlled kind that happens when you have been holding something for 8 hours and your body has simply run out of ways to keep holding it. I pressed my hands over my face, and I cried for the nest I had left, and for the ring in its center, and for the 3 years that had been real to me, even if they had been strategic to someone else, and then I cried for the very specific cruelty of caring deeply about something that had never cared back in the same register, and then I was done. I washed my face in the small bathroom down the hall. I lay down in the narrow bed among the bolts of fabric, and I stared at the ceiling, and I thought with very deliberate clarity, I am 27 years old. I am a trained textile consultant with a good eye and a body of work that has nothing to do with Roan Vale. I am in Halveth. I am starting. I slept. Not well, but enough. In the morning, Dessa made eggs and asked me 1 direct question while she was cracking them. "Do you need me to contact anyone to tell them you are safe, or did you need to disappear for a while?" I said I needed to disappear for a while. She nodded, and did not ask anything further, and slid the eggs onto a plate in front of me, and that was the beginning of my life in Halveth. I helped in the shop for the first few weeks while I found my footing. Dessa's tailoring business served the city's working population, the kind of clients who needed alterations and practical mending and occasional formal wear, rather than the high-end commissions my textile consultation work had occasionally brushed against. I was useful to her, and she was useful to me in the more important sense of providing a context in which I had something to do with my hands every day, and in hands with work to do are harder to turn against their owner. My name was a problem, but only in the technical sense. Kieran Ashvale was the bonded name I had taken when I married Roan. combining my birth surname with his pack name the way bonded Omegas traditionally did. I went back to my mother's name, Kieran Sale. It felt like putting on an old coat that had been waiting in a closet and still fit perfectly even after years of not being worn. I told Dessa and she nodded, and that was that. The bond was the larger problem. The severing of an unbonded pairing is uncomplicated. The severing of a bonded pairing, one where the marking has occurred and the Omega has nested with the Alpha for years and allowed the bond to develop full depth, is a different matter entirely. I could feel the severed end of it the way you feel a missing tooth with your tongue, the persistent awareness of an absence. The bond had not been fully broken because only Roan could initiate that severance formally, and he had not done so because he did not know where I was. What this meant practically was that I lived with a low-grade physical ache on the side of my neck where Roan's mark sat, and a periodic pull toward the direction I had come from, and the occasional intrusive moment of feeling Roan's emotional state from a distance without being able to identify it precisely. It was manageable. It was not pleasant. I managed it. 6 weeks into my time in Halveth, Dessa came to find me in the fabric room where I was reorganizing her bolt inventory by weight because I needed something to do with my hands at midnight, and she sat down on the narrow bed and said, "Roan Vale has been making inquiries." I stopped with a bolt of heavy navy wool in my hands. "How do you know that?" A pack contact in the Northern Network told me he was asking around the port cities. She looked at me steadily. "He has not found you yet, but Halveth is not large. If he is looking systematically, he will reach here within a few weeks." I held the bolt of navy wool and thought about this. "Do you want to move further?" she said. "I can give you contacts in the South Coast cities. Or I can tell the pack contact that you are not here." I thought about what it meant that Roan was looking. It could mean he had felt the bond severance and was trying to restore an operational asset. It could mean Cassiel had told him what had happened. It could mean something else entirely, some version of events I did not yet have access to. The problem with leaving the way I had, without confrontation and without explanation, was that I had not given him the bill of particulars. I had simply vanished, and my absence was a message he would have to interpret, and I did not know what interpretation he had arrived at. I set the bolt of navy wool back in its place. "Tell the pack contact I am not here," I said, "and in the morning let us talk about the South Coast." Dessa nodded. She stood and went to the door. Then she paused and said, without turning around, "You were not nothing, Kieran. Whatever they said you were not nothing." I looked at the navy wool. "I know," I said, "but I'm still going to need to build the proof of that somewhere he cannot see it." She left. I sat in the fabric room for a long time after that, listening to the harbor sounds coming through the small window, the low bells in the water and the occasional distant voice of someone working a night shift on the docks, and I thought about proof. Proof was the work. Proof was the thing I was already good at, the thing that had nothing to do with Roan Vale or the Vale Pack or 3 years of being useful in a way I had not understood. My textile consultation work had been small and quiet during the marriage because Roan had not asked me to stop, but had also not encouraged expansion, and I understood now that a quietly occupied Omega was a settled Omega, was a well-functioning social adhesive, and my professional ambition had simply been another thing managed without my awareness. In Halveth there was no management. 2 days later I moved to a city called Sarath, on the south coast, where Dessa's contact ran a high-end fabric import business and had agreed to take me on as a junior consultant. The business was called Tidal Holdings, and it operated it out of a converted warehouse 2 blocks from the water. And on my first day, the owner, a sharp-eyed woman named Orvin, looked at my portfolio for exactly 4 minutes, and then offered me a salary that made my quiet composure work considerably harder than usual to maintain. I said yes. I found a small flat 3 streets away from the warehouse. I bought 2 pots and a blanket and a single chair, and I started building in the most literal possible sense, from almost nothing. Sarath was larger than Halveth and far enough from the northern territories that the Vol name carried no particular weight. The city had its own pack structures loosely maintained in the way of port cities where transient populations and trade relationships made rigid hierarchy impractical. The dominant pack in the area held the harbor district and concerned themselves primarily with shipping contracts and did not particularly interfere with the daily lives of unaffiliated Omegas, who kept to themselves and paid their rent, and did good work. I kept to myself. I paid my rent. I did good work. Orvin was a demanding employer in the best possible sense, the kind who gave you genuinely difficult problems, and then watched with visible satisfaction when you solved them cleanly. Within 3 months I had taken over the supplier relationship with a northeastern textile mill that had been causing consistent quality issues, negotiated a revised inspection protocol, and resolved a 6-month dispute about dye lot inconsistency that had been costing the business a meaningful sum. Orvin gave me a raise and a title upgrade and said nothing further about it, which I understood as high praise. I also in those months began to feel the bond's pull changing. The severed end of a deep bond does not simply remain static. It changes as the Omega's circumstances change, as the emotional and pheromonal chemistry shifts, as distance and time do their particular work. The ache on my neck became intermittent rather than constant. The directional pull toward the north lost its urgency. What remained was more complex, a kind of emotional residue that surfaced sometimes in the evenings when I was sitting in my flat with the window open and the salt air coming in and the city settling into its nighttime sounds. What I felt in those moments was difficult to name. It was not exactly missing him. It was something more like this, the grief of a specific understanding. The understanding that I had been genuinely happy in some of those 3 years, that the happiness had been real, even if the premise had not, and that the loss of the happiness and the loss of the premise were two separate and differently shaped griefs that I was going to have to process on separate tracks. I was in the middle of the less complicated one. The premise grief was harder, and I was being patient with it. 7 months after I arrived in Sarath, I received through Dessa a formal legal notice from a PAC attorney in the Northern Territories. Roan Vale was initiating formal bond severance proceedings, which required my signature and presence at a legal consultation. I looked at this document for a long time. Then I called the number on the notice. The attorney who answered was brisk and professional, and asked me to confirm my identity and my willingness to proceed. I confirmed both. The attorney told me the severance proceeding required a neutral location consultation, that Roan had agreed to any location I named, and that the process would take approximately 2 meetings, the first to establish terms, and the second to finalize. I named Sarath. Neutral ground on my ground. The attorney made a note. Then she said, and I want you to know she said it with the flat legal neutrality of someone conveying information rather than an opinion. Mr. Vale has asked me to tell you that he would prefer to speak with you directly before the first meeting, if you are willing. I held the phone. No, I said. Tell him I will see him at the first meeting. Nothing before. A pause. Then, understood. She gave me the date, and I wrote it down and ended the call and sat in my flat with the window open and the salt air coming in, and thought about what it would mean to be in the same room as Roan Vale again, with the severed bond between us like a frayed rope, and everything I now knew laid out between us like a table neither of us had set. It would mean he would see what 7 months had built. That was the thing I found I cared about most. Not the confrontation, and not the words that would or would not be said, but the fact that he would walk into a room where I had built something real, and he would have to look at it. I went back to work. 3 weeks before the meeting, the warehouse hired a new shipping liaison for the Southern Port contracts. He arrived on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing a dye certification report at my desk near the window that overlooked the sorting floor. And Orvin introduced us with her characteristic brevity. Kieran, this is Idris Calloway. He managed the Southern Harbor relationships. Idris, this is Kieran Sale. He keeps our suppliers honest. I looked up. Idris Calloway was a tall man with warm brown skin and dark eyes and the particular unhurried quality of someone who had grown up near water. He was alpha, his pheromones the clean salt and cedar variety that port alphas often had, and he smiled at me, with the uncomplicated directness of someone who had no particular agenda beyond the immediate courtesy of a professional introduction. "Hello," he said. "I have heard you resolved the northeastern mill situation. The whole warehouse has been talking about it." I felt something shift slightly in the way I had been holding myself since arriving in Sarath, a very small loosening of something that had been carefully maintained, and I said, "It was mostly a communication problem dressed up as a quality problem. Those are the easiest ones once you see what they actually are." He looked at me with what I would later identify as genuine interest rather than the performed interest of someone executing a social function. "Communication problems dressed as quality problems," he said. "That is the most useful reframing I've heard in 6 months of logistics work." I went back to my certification report. He went to his own desk across the sorting floor, but I was aware of him in the specific way that an Omega who has been very careful about not being aware of anything for 7 months is suddenly aware of something. And I noted that awareness and set it aside and kept working. He asked me to have lunch 3 days later. I said no. He said no problem and did not ask again, and we continued to work alongside each other with the easy professionalism of people who were both good at what they did and had correctly identified that the work was what mattered. 2 weeks later, I said yes to lunch. This is not the moment of the story. This is the texture of it, the way the story was actually being lived rather than how it would eventually be told. The moment comes later. But the texture matters because it was a texture entirely of my own making, my own choices, my own time, and I want to be precise about that because it is the thing that made the moment possible when it finally arrived. We ate at a harbor restaurant that served grilled fish and good bread, and Idris talked about the shipping contracts with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely found logistics interesting, and I talked about the Northeastern Mill situation in more detail than I had talked about anything professional with anyone who was not Orvin in 7 months. And by the end of it, I felt, for the first time since leaving the Vale compound, like a person having an ordinary lunch with another person, rather than a person carefully managing the distance between themselves and everything that might matter. It was such a small thing, such a completely ordinary small thing. And it was the best I had felt in 7 months. I walked back to the warehouse feeling the salt air on my face and thinking about Roan's meeting in 2 weeks, and I thought, I am ready, not ready to forgive, not ready for anything to be resolved or repaired or made into a different shape than what it was. Ready in the simpler and more important sense of, I know what I have now. I know what I built. I know what I am worth. I am ready to be in that room. 2 weeks later, on a gray Tuesday morning with the harbor fog still sitting low over the water, I walked into the neutral office the attorney had arranged in a downtown building, sat down in the chair on my side of the conference table, and waited. Roan Vale walked in 7 minutes later. He was the same. Dark black hair, the gray eyes, the careful way he moved. He was wearing a coat I recognized, the charcoal one he wore in autumn, and the familiarity of it landed somewhere behind my ribs with a precision I had not entirely prepared for. The severed bond hummed faintly at the sight of his mark on my neck, the way a compass needle responds to proximity. He looked at me across the conference table, and his expression did the specific thing I had spent 7 months trying not to think about, which was that it held genuine feeling. Not the performance of feeling. Something that looked from where I was sitting like it actually hurt. He sat down. The attorney was present but positioned herself near the door as though she understood that the actual meeting was happening between the two people at the table before the legal meeting began. Kieran, he said. His voice was careful in the specific way it got when he was controlling something large. Roan, I said. I looked at him steadily, the way a person looks at something they have prepared to look at. And my hands were flat on the table. My breathing was even. I had 7 months of salt air and good work and an ordinary lunch with a good person in my body. And I had left my ring in the center of our nest, and I had walked out and I had built something real. And I was sitting in this room now, not as someone who had been disposed of, but as someone who had made a choice and lived with it and arrived, intact and clear-eyed, on the other side of it. He looked at me, and I could see him seeing all of that. I heard what you said to Cassiel, I said, before he could speak again. I am not here for an explanation. I am here for the severance. Something moved across his face. It was complicated, and I noted all of it and set it aside because I had not come here to read his feelings. I'd come here to close a door properly so that neither of us had to stand in the hallway of it for the rest of our lives. The attorney moved to the table. She opened the documents. Whatever Roan had come here to say, he did not say it then. He looked at me for one more long moment, and then he looked at the documents. And I thought about Idris Calloway and the harbor restaurant and the good bread and the salt air, and I held the pen in my hand and I was entirely quietly ready, continuing in the next part. But he did not sign immediately. He set the pen down with a deliberateness that I recognized as the specific version of Roan Vale choosing his words, and he said, I need you to know that I know what you heard, and I know it is not something I can argue against because I said it. I said it in that exact way. I'm not going to tell you it was taken out of context because it was not. I looked at him. He continued, I am also not going to tell you that everything I felt for you was a lie, because it was not. And I understand that does not change anything, but I need you to know that it is true. The attorney was very still near the table. I held Roan's gaze for a long moment. Then I said, I believe you that it was not all a lie. I also believe that a feeling you did not examine carefully enough to understand what it was sitting alongside is not the same as a feeling that was honest. You felt something for me, Roan. You used me for something. Both of those things can be true at the same time, and the second one does not become smaller because the first one exists. He looked at his hands on the table. I know, he said. His voice was quiet. Then sign the documents, I said, not unkindly, just directly. and let us both go and build something that was not built on a calculation neither of us consented to together. He picked up the pen. The documents were signed in the order the attorney specified. When it was done, she gathered them and stepped out to make copies, and Roan and I were briefly alone in the room, and I felt the bond's severed end shift as the legal process engaged the formal channels. A subtle change in the quality of the pull, like a tide beginning to turn. He looked at me one more time. He said, "Are you well?" Not as an opening to a longer conversation, just the question itself. "I am," I said. "Genuinely." He nodded. Something in his expression was not relief exactly, but was adjacent to it, the specific relief of knowing that the damage you did has not been permanent. "Good," he said. "That matters to me. Whatever you think of what I did, that matters to me." I looked at him and I thought about the nest I had left and the ring in its center and the train and the 8 hours and the harbor and Odessa and the fabric room and Sereth and Orvin and the northeastern mill and the salt air and an ordinary lunch with a good man on a Thursday. "I know it does," I said. "That is not the problem. The problem was that it mattered to you the same way a well-maintained investment matters. I deserved something that mattered differently." He did not argue. He looked at the table and then he looked at me, and what was in his face was the specific expression of a person who has been shown something precisely true about themselves and cannot refute it and is sitting with the weight of that. The attorney returned. She distributed the copies. She confirmed the formal bond severance would be processed within the standard timeline, 10 to 14 days, and that both parties would receive notification. We stood. Roan held out his hand, which was a formal gesture and also a genuine one. I shook it. His hand was warm and familiar, and I held it for exactly the right amount of time and let it go, and picked up my bag and walked to the door. I did not look back. Not because looking back would have broken me, the way it might have 6 months ago, but because I had already seen everything in that room that I needed to see, and what was waiting outside the door was the part that mattered now. The harbor fog had lifted while I was inside. The Tuesday morning was clear and cold and bright, the kind of autumn light that makes everything look precise. I could smell the salt air and hear the distant bells of the working harbor, and somewhere in the warehouse, two blocks from the water, there was work waiting for me, and a salary I had earned, and a growing portfolio, and a colleague with warm brown eyes who had asked me once about communication problems dressed as quality problems, and genuinely meant the question. I walked toward it. The severance notification arrived 14 days later, as promised. I was at my desk at Tidal Holdings when the legal document came through to my correspondence address. A neat single-page confirmation that the bond between Kieran Sale and Roan Vale had been formally dissolved under Pack Law and Civil Registry, effective the date of signing. I read it once. I folded it and placed it in the small file I kept for important documents in the bottom drawer of my desk. Then I went back to reviewing the inspection reports from the mill in the northeast, because there was a batch of wool that had arrived 3 shades darker than specified, and I needed to draft a supplier notice before end of day. The physical change was immediate and unmistakable. I had been living with the severed end of the bond for 7 months. The persistent ache at my neck, the directional pull, the intermittent emotional residue of feeling Roan's state from a distance. All of that had become so much a part of my daily landscape that I'd stopped consciously registering it, the way you stop hearing a clock in a room you spend enough time in. When the bond formally dissolved, the silence it left was not emptiness. It was the sudden awareness of how much background noise I had been carrying without knowing. The ache on my neck eased over the course of a week. The mark itself, which had been a faint raised line since the night I left, faded to something barely visible, a ghost of a mark rather than a living one. The directional pull went quiet. And the emotional residue, those evening moments of sensing something distant and unnamed, stopped entirely. What replaced all of it was a clarity I had not had in 3 years. I had not known how much of my interior weather had been filtered through this bond until the bond was gone. I had not known how much I had been quietly orienting myself in relation to someone else, taking readings off his pheromonal state, calibrating my own emotions partly in response to his, making 1,000 small adjustments I had never consciously identified as adjustments. Without it, I felt, for the first time in 3 years, entirely and only myself. It was disorienting for about a week. Then it was simply the truth of how I was made, and I found I liked it. Idris noticed. Not the bond dissolution specifically, because that was not something visible from the outside in any obvious way. But he noticed the change in how I moved through the warehouse, through our shared lunches, through the easy working rhythm we had established over the preceding weeks. One afternoon, toward the end of the first week after the dissolution, he looked at me across the desk where we were reviewing a harbor transit schedule and said, "You seem different this week." "Different how?" I said. "Less like someone waiting for something to land on them," he said. "More like someone who already knows what their feet feel like under them." I looked at him. He was not wrong, and the fact that he had seen it precisely enough to say it in those words without knowing the mechanism told me something about the quality of attention he paid to the things he actually cared about. "I'm working something out," I said. "In the finishing stages." He nodded and went back to the transit schedule. He did not push for more, which was one of the things I had noticed about Idris Calloway. He had a natural sense of where the boundary of an invitation was, and he respected it without making the respect itself into a performance. He was simply not the kind of person who made you feel observed when he was paying attention to you. This was, I understood by now, profoundly rare. We had settled into something over those weeks that I did not have a precise name for yet. It was not courtship in any formal sense. No, there had been no declarations, no gestures that crossed the line into explicit intent. But there was the lunch twice a week that had become an established pattern without either of us formally establishing it. There was the habit he had developed of leaving a second coffee on my desk in the mornings when he arrived before me, without comment, without expectation of acknowledgement beyond the small nod I had started giving him. There was the way we worked together, which had evolved from professional proximity into something that operated on an intuitive shared frequency, the kind where you hand someone a page before they have finished asking for it and neither of you remarks on it. No. There was the evening 3 weeks after the bond dissolution, when Orvin asked us both to stay late to resolve an emergency with a damaged freight consignment, and we spent 4 hours together in the warehouse, sorting and documenting 1,000 yards of water-damaged silk by lamplight. And somewhere in the middle of the 4th hour, Idris started narrating his assessment of each bolt in increasingly detailed and absurd terms. And I laughed for the first time since arriving in Sarath in the unself-conscious way that happens when you are tired and the situation is genuinely funny and the person you are laughing with has earned that version of you. He looked at me when I laughed, just for a moment. Something warm and very deliberate in his expression. Then he went back to the silk and said, "This one I would describe as drowned ballroom, moderately salvageable. Possible second life as theatrical costume." I picked up the next bolt and said, "This one is beyond redemption. It smells like a harbor argument." He laughed. It was a good sound, low and unguarded, the kind that comes from the chest. I filed it away carefully in the part of myself that was learning, after 3 years of careful management, what it felt like when something was simply good and did not require interrogation. Meanwhile, in the north, things were happening that I was not present for, but that would eventually find their way to me, through Dessa's quiet network, and through the particular way that pack politics move through connected communities like weather systems, slow building, and impossible to entirely avoid. Roan had returned to the Vale compound after the severance meeting with the signed documents and the particular expression, I was told much later, of a man who had been asked to look directly at something he had preferred not to examine too closely, and had not been able to look away. He had said nothing publicly about where I had gone or why. The official account of the pact was that the bond had been dissolved by mutual agreement, which was technically accurate in the specific legal sense, and deeply incomplete in every human sense. Cassiel Brandt, his beta second, had said nothing to anyone either. Cassiel's silence was the calculated kind, the silence of someone who understood that the version of events most favorable to his own position was also the version that required saying the least. The problem was that pacts are not systems of managed information. They are networks of relationship and pheromone and accumulated history, and when something happens at the center of a pack, the outer rings of that network feel the disturbance even when no one has said anything explicit about what caused it. The older pack members, those who had been close to these previous alpha and who had watched Roan's bond with me with the specific satisfaction of people who had seen this pack's warmth and cohesion improve markedly over 3 years, felt my absence before they understood it. And Omega's pheromonal contribution to a pack's social environment is not a small thing. I had been woven into the daily texture of the Vale compound for 3 years, present at meals and meetings and seasonal pack gatherings, my scent a quiet constant that the members had incorporated into their sense of what the pack smelled like, what safety and warmth and home meant in pheromonal terms. When I left, I took all of that with me. The compound became, in small but accumulating ways, less comfortable. Tensions that had been smoothed by my presence began to resurface. Minor disagreements that my pheromonal field had quietly dampened started to run a little hotter. The elder betas noticed first. 3 of them, women who had served the pack for 30 years and who had liked me in the specific way of people who recognize competence when they encounter it regardless of rank, went to Roan with the questions he had been hoping no one would ask. Why had I left? What had actually happened? Where was I? Roan told them the mutual agreement account. The first beta, whose name was Sura, and who had a reputation within the pack for asking the next question when everyone else had stopped, said, "That is the legal version. What is the human version?" Roan did not answer immediately. Cassiel, who was present, gave a small movement that Sura later described as the physical equivalent of someone very quietly trying to indicate that the conversation should end. Sura did not take the indication. So Sura asked Cassiel, directly in the flat manner of someone who has spent 30 years in a pack and has learned that the beta second is often where the actual information lives. And Cassiel, who was many things but was not, in the end, capable of lying directly to someone like Sura while she was looking at him that way, told her enough that she could construct the rest. What followed was not dramatic. Pack reckonings rarely are in the immediate sense. What happened was a quiet but irreversible change in the quality of regard that the elder members of the Veil Pack offered to their alpha. It was not hostility. It was something more corrosive than hostility, which was the specific withdrawal of the warmth that comes from being genuinely respected. An alpha without the genuine respect of his elder members is not a fallen alpha. He is something more uncomfortable than that, which is a standing alpha, working inside a structure that has quietly stopped believing in him. Every meeting, every meal, every pack gathering carries the particular weight of that withdrawal. It does not announce itself. It simply sits there, present and accumulating in the exact space where warmth used to be. Roan felt it. Pack alphas always feel it when the regard shifts, the same way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm, and even when the sky still looks clear. The allied packs felt it too, eventually. The Veil Pack had strengthened its interpack relationship substantially during the 3 years of our bond, partly through Roan's political work, and partly in ways that the allied alphas had noted and appreciated through this particular quality that a settled and genuinely bonded alpha carries in negotiations. An alpha who comes to the table with a stable home bond has a different pheromonal signature than one who is managing underlying instability, and other alphas read that signature accurately, even when they cannot name what they are reading. When I left and the bond dissolved, Roan's signature changed, and the allied alphas noticed, and questions were asked in the quiet way that interpack questions are asked, through intermediaries and careful social channels, about what had happened to the Veil Omega. The answer, when it eventually circulated, did Roan no good. I did not know the details of all of this as it was happening. I was in Serath, reviewing silk and wool and dye certifications, and eating harbor fish with Idris, and walking home through streets that smelled of salt water, and living a life that was mine, in a way that nothing had been mine for 3 years. Dessa sent me occasional brief messages through the quiet channel she maintained, and I read them and filed the information, and continued working. What I did not know, for several more weeks, was that Roan had tracked me to Serath. He had not used an investigator this time. He had used the bond, or rather the ghost of it. The faint residual trace that persists after formal severance in the way that scent lingers in a room after the source has been removed. It is not directional in any useful navigational sense, but it is locational in the broad sense of a pack alpha who spent 3 years sleeping beside an omega and knows the specific atmospheric quality of their presence well enough to recognize something adjacent to it in a city where that omega now lives. Roan had always been good at reading pheromonal environments. He had walked into Serath and felt, in the general direction of the harbor district, something that was not me but was the echo of where I was spending my days. He had not come to the severance meeting with the intention of finding me afterward. I believed that then, and I believe it now. But the severance meeting had done something to him that the weeks following had not resolved, and at some point, the doing of something, even something insufficient, had become more bearable than the continuing to do nothing. I found out he was in Serath because Idris told me. This requires a small explanation. Idris had, over the preceding weeks, learned enough about my situation to understand the general shape of it without knowing all the specific details. I had not told him about Roan explicitly, but I had said enough, in the way that two people who are gradually becoming close say things obliquely before they say them directly, for him to understand that I had left a significant relationship under difficult circumstances, and had come to Serath to rebuild. He had not pressed for more than I offered. He had simply held what I gave him with the same careful attention he brought to everything. What he knew specifically about Roan was this. I had mentioned once, in passing, during one of our Wednesday lunches, that the person I had left was a pack alpha from the Northern Territories. Idris knew pack dynamics the way a port man knows shipping routes, practically and without sentimentality. He had understood immediately what it meant that I had left a bonded alpha arrangement, and had not said so explicitly, which told me he had been paying attention to the things I was not saying as much as the things I was. On the Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the bond dissolution, Idris arrived at the warehouse before me, and left not a second coffee, but a note beside my keyboard. It said, "There is an alpha from the north asking questions about the textile consultant at Tidal Holdings. Harbor contacts told me this morning. I thought you should know before he finds the building." I read the note. I sat with it for a moment. Then I went to find Orvin, because if Roan Vale was at Sarath asking questions about where I worked, I was not going to pretend he was not, and I was not going to let him arrive at my place of work without warning. Orvin listened to the brief version with the specific quality of attention she brought to problems. Then she said, "Do you want me to handle it, or do you want to handle it yourself?" "I want to handle it myself," I said, "but I want you to know in case it becomes a problem." She nodded. Her office, then, if he comes here. Not the floor. He sat in her chair for the meeting with the Northeastern Mill Suppliers last month, and she had noticed the specific thing that a Pack Alpha's presence does to a professional space. The way it subtly reorganizes the pheromonal environment in ways that affect how other people in the space are feeling, whether they identify the mechanism or not. She was not going to have that happening on her sorting floor. He arrived at 2 in the afternoon. I'd spent the morning working and not thinking about it, which is a skill that takes practice and which I had been developing for 7 months. I reviewed a dye certification from a mill in the South region, and I drafted a supplier query about inconsistent thread weight in a recent wool delivery, and I drank the coffee Idris had left on my desk, and I did not look at the door more than twice. The work was real, and it required real attention, and I gave it that attention because it deserved it, and because giving genuine attention to real work is one of the most reliable ways to stay located in the present rather than anticipating a future that has not happened yet. Idris worked at his desk across the floor and did not look at me more than once, which I understood as a form of consideration. He was giving me the same space he always gave me, the undemonstrative steadiness of someone who is present without being a presence that requires management. I was in Orvin's office when the front desk assistant came to tell me there was a Roan Vale asking to speak with me. I had Idris's note in my pocket. I had Orvin's calm nod from across the room. I had 7 months of salt air and work and a growing portfolio and 14 days of formal severance and ordinary lunch that had been becoming less ordinary in the best possible sense. I said, "Send him up." He came in, and the first thing I thought was that he looked tired in a way that went below the surface, the particular tiredness of someone whose home environment has shifted under them and who has not yet found the new footing. He was wearing the charcoal coat again. His dark hair was pushed back from his face. His gray eyes found me immediately and stayed there. I was sitting in one of the 2 chairs in front of Orvin's desk. I did not stand when he came in. I indicated the other chair. He sat. "You found me," I said. "It took longer than it should have," he said. He said it without pride or self-justification. Just the statement. "What do you want, Roan?" He looked at his hands briefly, then back at me. "I want to say something I did not say at the meeting," he said, "and I want to say it without the attorney present and without the documents on the table." I waited. He said, "I built something with you that I told myself was strategic, and that was genuinely not only strategic, and I understood that too late and handled the understanding badly, and what I did to you and the way I spoke about you was a betrayal that I cannot argue is anything other than what it was." He paused. "I know the severance is done. I am not here to ask you to reverse it or to reconsider anything. I am here because I need you to know that what you heard was not the whole truth, even though what you heard was true. The whole truth is that I did not know what I had until you left, and I had to examine what I had actually built without the excuse of the pack bond and the strategic framing to hide behind." I looked at him. I said, "I believe you that this is true. I also need you to understand that it does not change anything between us. I do not say that coldly. I say it precisely. What you are describing is a man who grew into understanding he had something real only after he lost it, and that is a real thing, and I do not dismiss it. But it is not a thing that belongs to us, Roan. It belongs to you, to take into whatever you build next." Something in his face shifted. Not devastated, something quieter than devastated, the specific expression of a person receiving a difficult thing they have already half accepted and are now completing the acceptance of. He said, "Are you well?" The same question he had asked at the meeting, but said differently this time, with more weight behind it, with the specific inflection of someone who actually needs to know, and not just someone completing a courtesy. I thought about the warehouse and the silk by lamplight and the second coffee left without comment and the harbor fish and the sound of a good laugh and the salt air. I am, I said. More than I was. More than I was in a long time, actually. He nodded slowly. There was something in his expression then that I can only describe as a very clean kind of grief, the kind that does not fight itself. He looked at the window for a moment. He looked back at me. Good, he said. His voice was quiet and entirely genuine and carried absolutely no agenda. That is what I needed to know. He stood. I stood. We did not shake hands this time. He nodded once, the specific nod of someone who has said the thing they came to say and is now going to go and live with having said it, and he walked to the door. He paused there. Without turning around, he said, "The nest. I should tell you, I could not dismantle it. I tried. I left it. I held that. Thank you for telling me," I said. He left. I stood in Orvin's office for a moment after the door closed, one hand resting on the back of the chair I'd been sitting in, and I thought about a nest woven over weeks from fabric my mother had sold, left in a stone house on the eastern edge of a compound in the Northern Territories, holding a bonding ring with an amber stone, and I thought about the 3 years that had been real in the way that things can be real, even when their premise is wrong. And I let myself feel that completely for the space of one long breath. Then I walked out of the office and down to the sorting floor. Idris was at his desk. He looked up when I came down the stairs. His expression asked the question without asking it. "He is gone," I said. "It is done." Idris nodded. He did not ask for more. He turned back to his transit schedule, and then after a moment he said, "I was thinking about that harbor restaurant, the one with the good bread. They have a new autumn menu starting this week, apparently." I sat down at my desk. I looked at the wool certification report I had been working on before all of this began. I said, "Thursday." "Thursday," he said. I went back to work. The weeks after Roan's visit settled into the best kind of ordinary, the kind that is not the absence of feeling, but the presence of the right kind of feeling, warm and unforced and daily. Idris and I had the Thursday dinner, and it was the easiest 2 hours I had spent in years. The kind of ease that comes not from the absence of tension, but from the particular comfort of being entirely yourself with another person, and having that be enough. We talked about shipping logistics and textile markets and the specific unreasonable opinions we were each held about certain harbor fish preparations, and at the end of it, Idris walked me to my building door and said, "Same time next week," and I said yes, and went upstairs feeling the kind of lightness that I had not known I was waiting for. The dinners became Thursdays and Tuesdays, the coffee on my desk became a daily thing. The working rhythm became, by degrees, something more personal and around its edges, a pattern of small considerations and small kindnesses that accumulated over weeks into something that had its own weight and warmth. He told me one Tuesday evening as we were closing down our respective desks that he had grown up near the water in a small fishing town 3 days south, that his mother was an Omega who had raised him and his 2 siblings after his alpha father died when Idris was 12, and that she had done it with such complete competence and such obvious fullness of self that he had grown up understanding Omegas as people, rather than as a category. A distinction, he said, with the plainness of someone stating a fact rather than seeking praise for it. He told me about his mother's hands, how they had always smelled of the sea and machine oil, how she had kept the family boat running herself for 3 years after his father died, because selling it would have meant something irreversible about the shape of their grief. He told me this the way people tell you the things that made them, simply and without performance, trusting you to understand why they are telling you. I told him on a Thursday that I had been bonded, and that the bond had been dissolved, and that the reason I had come to Sereth was that I had needed to build something that belonged entirely to me. I did not tell him about Roan's visit to the office. Not yet. But I told him enough that the shape of it was clear, and he received the shape of it without flinching, without the particular carefulness that sometimes looks like sympathy, but is actually discomfort. He said, "The portfolio you built here, it is genuinely good work. Not good for someone rebuilding, good in the absolute sense." I looked at him. He said, "I just want you to know that the proof does not need to be for anyone else. It already is what it is." I thought about what Dessa had said in the fabric room months ago. "You were not nothing, Kieran." I thought about Roan in Orvin's office saying the nest was still there. I thought about the amber ring in the center of blankets I had woven by hand. I thought about all the different shapes that a person's worth takes, and the different ways it has to be held before it can be known. I said, "I know. I am just learning to know it from the inside instead of the outside." He looked at me for a moment with that warm, deliberate quality. Then he said, "I would like to take you somewhere that is not a harbor restaurant next Thursday, if you are willing." I said yes. It was a small theater on the edge of the harbor district that showed old films on a rolling program. The kind of place with mismatched seats and good sound and the particular atmosphere of something that has been loved for a long time by the right kind of people. We sat next to each other in the small dark room and watched a film I had not seen before, and at some point in the second hour his hand found mine in the dark, not suddenly, not dramatically, simply there, warm and steady and entirely unhurried, and I turned my hand to meet it, and we sat like that until the film ended. Outside afterward in the harbor night, with the water sounds all around us and the lights of the working harbor reflected in dark water, he looked at me and said, "I want to tell you something." I said, "Tell me." He said, "I have been paying attention to you since the first week you arrived here, not in a way that required anything from you. I just wanted you to know that it has been a considered thing, and not an accidental one." I looked at him in the harbor night. This tall, unhurried man who had grown up near water and who left coffee without comment and who described damaged silk as a drowned ballroom and who had told me my work was good in the absolute sense. And I thought about all the forms that evidence takes, and I said, "I have been paying attention to you too. That has also been a considered thing." He smiled. It was not a careful smile or a practiced one. It was the unguarded kind that happens when you have been patient about something for long enough that the arrival of it is simply a relief. He walked me home. At my building door he pressed a very careful kiss to my temple, his hand briefly on my jaw, warm and deliberate, and then he stepped back and said good night and walked away down the harbor street, and I stood in the door for a moment, feeling the salt air and the night and the complete absence of anything I needed to calculate or manage. I went upstairs. I sat in my single chair by the open window. I looked at my flat, which was no longer quite so bare as it had been when I arrived, which had accumulated over 7 months, the particular warmth of a place lived in by someone who knows how to make a home. A good blanket, plants on the window ledge, bolts of sample fabric in the corner, because Orvin had started sending me home with samples, and I had started using them for reference. The textile consultation portfolio growing in the drawer beside the legal document I had folded and filed. I thought about the nest and the stone house in the north, and the ring in its center, and the 3 years, and the train, and the 8 hours, and Dessa, and the fabric room, and Orvin and the northeastern mill, and the bond's dissolution, and the harbor, and the damaged silk by lamplight, and a film in a small dark theater, and a hand in the dark, and a kiss at a door. I thought about Idris walking away down the harbor street, and the particular quality of someone who goes away, and you know they are coming back because they are the kind of person who means what they do. I thought about all the different ways a person gets to proof. And then I stopped thinking and simply sat in the chair with the salt air coming through the window and the harbor sounds settling into their nighttime pattern and felt, for the first time in a very long time, the specific piece of a person who is exactly where they chose to be. The seasons move forward the way they do in port cities, not with a dramatic shift of inland seasons, but with a gradual deepening of cold and the specific quality of light changing over the water. By midwinter, Idris and I had settled into a shape that the people who worked around us recognized before either of us had named it formally. Orvin said nothing, but began scheduling us on the same site visits with the particular efficiency of someone who had noticed a working combination, and was not inclined to disrupt it. The warehouse staff, for their part, simply incorporated us into the workplace geography in the way that workplaces do, the way that people arrange themselves around what is actually true rather than what has been officially stated. We had not bonded. We had not talked about bonding. What we had was something that was building itself carefully and in good light, with both of us present and both of us choosing. And I had learned enough about the difference between that and its opposite to know that this version was the one worth protecting. One evening in midwinter, sitting at my kitchen table with a pot of tea and the sound of harbor wind against the window, I received a message from Dessa. She said, "Sura of the Volpack contacted me. She wants you to know that the elder members formally proposed a pack restructure. Roan has agreed. Cassiel Brandt has stepped down as second. A new council structure is being established with elder oversight on major pack decisions, including bonding arrangements. She says they wanted you to know. She says you would understand what it means." I read the message twice. Then I poured the tea and held the cup in both hands and thought about Sura, who had asked the next question when everyone else had stopped. I thought about the elder betas who had served the pack for 30 years, and who had liked me in the specific way of people who recognize competence regardless of rank. I thought about what it meant that they had moved to protect the next person in the position I had left. I wrote back to Dessa, "Tell Sura thank you. Tell her I understand what it means." I sent the message. I drank the tea. Outside, the harbor wind moved through the streets in the particular way of midwinter, carrying the smell of cold water and distance. Inside my flat, the plants on the window ledge were doing fine. The portfolio in the drawer was fuller than it had been in autumn. There was a second cup on the kitchen table because Idris had been here earlier and we had eaten and talked, and he had gone home to his own place 3 streets over, which was the current shape of things. Easy and unhurried and solid in the particular way of something neither of us was rushing because neither of us needed to. I thought about the amber ring in the nest in the north. I thought about whether it was still there. I thought about the blankets woven by hand and the 3 years and what they had been and what they had not been, and the specific way that a person's history belongs to them even when parts of it hurt, because the hurt is also part of what shaped the footing you are standing on now. I did not know if the ring was still in the nest. I found that I had stopped needing to know. It was Roan's thing to carry now, that particular weight, and I hoped he carried it well because carrying things well is how a person eventually puts them down. My thing was here. My thing was the portfolio in the drawer and the plants on the ledge, and the salt air through the window, and the work I was good at in the absolute sense, and the warm, unhurried man 3 streets over who left coffee without comment and walked me home from small theaters and had told me, simply and without agenda, that his attention had been a considered thing. Spring came to Sarath the way it comes to port cities, suddenly and completely, the cold lifting over the course of a week, and the harbor smelling entirely different, the particular aliveness of water when the season turns. The market 2 streets from my flat started selling early flowers again. The workers on the harbor docks wore fewer layers. The light came differently through the warehouse windows, warmer and at a new angle, catching the dust motes above the sorting floor in long gold columns in the afternoons. I opened the window in the mornings and stood with my tea and felt the changing air and thought, this is mine. Orvin gave me a promotion in early spring. The title was Senior Textile Consultant with a corresponding adjustment to my remuneration and a new scope of work that included supplier development in 2 additional regions. She delivered it in her characteristic way, a single sentence over the morning briefing documents, and then went back to the briefing as though she had simply noted a fact about the weather. I accepted it in the same register. We were both people who understood that the acknowledgement was the thing, and the acknowledgement had been given, and we could return to work. I told my mother that evening on a call, and she cried a little in the quiet way she had, which was the highest praise in the vocabulary of the Sale family. I told Dessa in a message, and she replied with a single word, good. I told Idris the following morning, and he looked at me with the warm, deliberate quality and said, I told you it was good in the absolute sense. I said, you did. He said, are you going to celebrate, or are you going to immediately move on to what comes next? I thought about this. Then I said, both, in that order. He smiled. We celebrated with harbor fish and good bread at the restaurant we had been returning to for months now, our table near the window that looked out at the water. And it was one of those evenings that accumulates its own meaning simply by being exactly what it is, unhurried and warm and complete. Afterward, walking home along the harbor, he stopped and turned to me and said, I want to ask you something. I stopped beside him. The harbor was dark, and the lights were out across the water, and the spring air was cool and alive. He said, I am not asking about bonding. I am asking about something simpler than that, and also, I think, something that matters more than that, which is whether you want this to be what it clearly already is. Clearly to me, I mean. I do not want to assume it is clear to you in the same way. I looked at him in the harbor night, this man I had been paying attention to for months, with the specific quality of attention that a person who has been burned learns to reserve for things that are actually worth the heat. I said, it is clear to me. It has been clear to me for a while. He exhaled, just once, the specific exhale of relief. Then he took my hand the same way we had in the dark theater, simply and without drama, and we walked the rest of the way home together. That is where the story arrives. Not at a bonding ceremony or a dramatic declaration or a public moment of vindication, though there had been a kind of vindication in the quiet restructuring of the veil pack and in the senior consultant title, and in the proof I had built in the only place that had ever mattered, which was in myself. The story arrives at a spring evening in a port city where the air smells of salt water and growing things, and a hand held without ceremony, and a flat on the 3rd floor where the plants are doing well and the portfolio is full and the windows open to the harbor air. In the particular feeling of a person who made a decision in a hallway with a cooling cup of tea and walked out of one life and into the long, patient work of building another. And built it, and stands now in the middle of what she built and knows it is hers. The ring is somewhere in the north, in a nest I made by hand, in a house that is not mine anymore and never was entirely, held in the center of blankets that were. I leave it there. A person's history belongs to them even when they are no longer living in it. The blankets were good work. I made them well. I have made other things since. I am Kieran Sale. I am a senior textile consultant in the city of Serath. I walked out of a hallway carrying nothing but what I knew about myself in a single bag, and I built everything else from that. And what I built is real in the only sense that matters, which is that it belongs to me, and no one constructed it on my behalf for purposes I was not told about. The harbor is loud in spring. The work is good. The air through the window smells of salt and possibility. That is enough. That has always been enough. If you found yourself in this story today, if you have ever stood in a hallway holding something you made for someone else and learned what you were actually worth to them, then I hope you know that the ending is not written in the hallway. It is written in what you walk toward after. It is written in the work and the salt air and the ordinary lunches and the hands held in the dark and the slow, patient building of something that is yours. Like, share, and subscribe if this story reached you. My beautiful harbor angels, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and which moment stayed with you longest. I read every message you leave, and they mean more than you know. Let us meet again soon with another story. Until then, be well, keep building, and never let anyone tell you that what you are worth is something they get to decide.